The Dharma, incomparably profound and is rarely met with, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the third day of this 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico in June 2023. And I'd like to address something that is absolutely vital in Zen practice, but very difficult to communicate. Suzuki-roshi, writing in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, called it beginner's mind. Seung-san Sunim, a Korean master, called it only don't know. Here we call it open to possibility, or openness to possibility. Because it is a mind state beyond words, it is almost impossible to express what it means. But let me give you a couple of examples. There is a person here who has spent many years in her younger years playing playing a wind instrument, and it was very interesting because in order to do that, she had to really learn how to do the extended out breath, and I believe also something called circular breathing, so that it wasn't obvious when she breathed in the middle of a note. But this extended out breath that she practiced daily in doing the French horn was a phenomenal beginning to Zen practice. What she said about it was that when she was playing, for example, in a concert or practice or whatever, and she was in the middle of a song or a piece of music, she was simply breathing out and experiencing that note, that sound, without any thought about its beginning or ending. That is beginner's mind. Such absorption that there's no me playing the French horn. For people who do art also, it can be the same thing, only we speak of it differently. When you are creating a piece of art, unless even if you're painting a still life, for example, you have to go into a wordless place within yourself, which gives you a sense of what exactly you're going to be painting, not what thing you're going to be painting, but how you're going to be painting it moment to moment. Which brush you're going to be using, which particular color you're going to be using at a given moment. And you don't sit there and think to yourself, well, let's see, that looks like a cyan blue. So let me figure out which exact color of blue it would be. No, something internal tunes in, recognizes the color, and moves you to choose, perhaps not the right color or the exact color, but through trial and error, eventually the right color. Unless you're doing something very abstract, in which case you can do whatever color you want. But there are very famous artists who simply experienced the working of their art. And for example, throwing buckets of paint on a canvas without any thought as to what it will look like, picking up a different bucket of paint and aiming that at some preconceived, not preconceived sense of where to throw it. If it's preconceived, then you're not in beginner's mind. But if there's just a sense of aiming at and then looking at the results of that on the painting, choosing the next bucket of paint, and not intellectually, but simply through an inner sense that goes beyond thought. It is not involved with thought, it is beneath thought. And if you try to, for example, play music, telling yourself what note you're going to be doing and for how long you're going to be doing it, as you're doing it, you're taking yourself away from the music, and you're not in that beginner's mind state. You're not in that openness to possibility mind state. Learning to ride a bike. You don't have a preconceived idea of how to ride a bike. You'd simply give it a try. I remember we had friends when we were living in Canada. We did not have bikes, my brother and I, but we had friends who had a bike, and this was back in the 1940s, so they really didn't have much in the way of women's bikes, and they certainly didn't have multi-speed bikes. And so this family friend, whenever we would go visit, my family and I and my brother, we would sort of ask if we could ride the bike. And back then, because it was not a girl's bike, I had to learn how to ride with putting my leg through under the crossbar, because I wasn't tall enough to do it riding on the seat. And we found that if you just kept trying, you'd sort of get the sense of balance, even though it wasn't a regular way to ride a bike, and gradually learned how to ride a bike. And then from then on, riding the bike is not something you think about. Your body just does it. You don't think, okay, I'm going to stop at this particular place, although maybe you have in mind that you're going to go to a particular end, and then you'll turn around and come back. But you don't think all the time you're riding about what this place is. You simply experience the riding of the bike. Now, as you get more proficient, you may decide to really start thinking a lot and just cruise along on automatic with your mind going in lots of different directions, or anticipating what you're going to do when you get to where you're going. But that is not beginner's mind. Beginner's mind is not knowing, not having any preconceived ideas about what you're going to see, what you're going to do. And this is a big challenge for beginning Zen practitioners in particular, because we are taught to think our way through life. We're taught to memorize words and spit them back, to analyze through words, and that is a major part of our education. Before we ever got to school, however, when we were small children, we simply explored without words. And it was quite marvelous. But then, of course, we learned to use our thinking skills, and we learned to use them to shut out being present, particularly if we've had unpleasant experiences when we're little. When we're chastised and we feel bad about it. When other things can happen to us that are unpleasant, and we try not to feel them. And we learn that we can avoid feeling by going into thought. And so we just sort of turn our backs on the sensations in our bodies and learn to override them with, or escape them through thinking. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, but we don't know that at the time. And it can take a lot of effort as we get older, when we realize perhaps that is just an escape and we need to go back to being present. The habit pattern of avoidance is so strong that we will have a difficult time unwinding it, becoming free of it. And so beginning Zen students, and I say beginning, goes for a long way, years, decades even. And when you walk into a Zendo for the first time, you may not have any expectation of what you're going to meet, particularly if you've never been in a Zendo before. And so the instructions of how to put your body in particular positions and what to do with your breath, what to do with your hands, what to do with your mind, keeping your eyes at half gaze or a quarter gaze, three-quarter gaze, and so on. Initially, it is brand new. And when it's brand new, of course, you haven't had any preconceived ideas about it. So that is also beginner's mind. I remember when I went to the workshop that was required back in the day when I was first starting to connect with the Rochester Zen Center. I'd already been doing Zazen on my own for several years. I think, well, I don't know about several, but I think it was a year and a half, something like that. And so we're all seated back then in the dining room at the Zen Center in Rochester. This is way before it was expanded to Chapin Mill Country Retreat Place. And suddenly there was a sound. And I didn't know what that sound was. I was trying to figure it out, but there was no way I could figure it out. It was an unusual sound. And so simply listening to the sound is another moment of unknowing, of openness to possibility, of beginner's mind, of only don't know. But pretty soon we get ideas about what we think we're going to get out of Zen practice. And then that becomes a hindrance. And we fight thoughts and we measure our seeming progress or lack of progress without really any knowledge of it, just what we might have read, for example. For some years in the beginning of my Zen Center time in Rochester, going to sesshin, I had read the 3 Pillars of Zen and was inspired, in essence kept alive by the enlightenment stories in the 3 Pillars. And so I kind of hung on to them because it was like a lifeline for me. I had already reached a point where I understood that there was nothing outside me that would ever bring me lasting happiness or peace. And so I was ready to bite the bullet and go in, not realizing what a challenging situation that would be. And so sesshin after sesshin, I worked on my koan, mu, with one eye, and with the other eye, I was measuring my seeming progress or lack of progress or attention or awareness in comparison to those enlightenment stories. And finally, I realized it was simply holding me back. I had to stop reading because it was interfering. It was putting thoughts in my head, and that was interfering with getting deeper into the practice itself, which is the only thing that would bring me to any kind of freedom. It was a great struggle to do that because I was so conditioned to turning my back on feelings, on things, on everything. I was living in my head. The only time I wasn't was when I had been doing commercial interior design, and I was able to drop into a sense of what would work in a given space for a given client, and search out then the things that would make that happen. That's a kind of thing, just like music, just like art, just like various other endeavors. For example, gardening. Yes, we can read the gardening books and get some ideas about what chemistry we wanted to create in our soil to make things grow, what kinds of things would grow in our area, and various things like that. But in actuality, we would, once we were armed with that information, we would plant things and then tune in and get a sense inwardly of whether they needed more water, whether they needed more fresh air, what they needed. You can go buy books and get a certain amount of information, but you're not tuning in to the greenery and connecting with what you can perceive it needs. It's not going to stand there and tell you, but there's certain qualities, colors of leaves, different appearances of the plant that will let you know what it needs. And these are not things that are analyzed. These are things that are understood from somewhere in your middle, I guess you would call it, somewhere beyond words. That also is a sense of beginner's mind. It is kind of interesting that many, many years ago, quite a few years ago at this point, it was in the 1970s, we had been living in Thailand, which was where we were posted after living in Burma. And then it was the State Department decided that they wanted to train my husband more fully into becoming a Southeast Asian expert. So there were 3 universities in the United States that had those specialties. And we ended up being sent to the University of Michigan because it was on a trimester system. So leaving Chiang Mai, Thailand in January, we could go right into Ann Arbor and right into classes. So the first thing that happened was that we were housed in brand new at the time, graduate student housing. And we had bought a little television set, and not having much else to do because we had no furniture yet. It was still being shipped from Chiang Mai. We would watch television, and they had a special on about rafting down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. It was called Taking the Colorado River, and it featured prominently the most frightening of the rapids that we were going to be going through. We'd already been talking about going down on that trip because my in-laws were wanting to make it a family project. So it was spoken about. So we watched this special on taking the Colorado River, and what's it called? Lava. I want to say Lava Falls, but I'm not sure that's what it was. It was a incredibly deep and frightening hole, supposedly 12 feet deep, although I have no idea how they measured that, that we were having to aim at in the middle of this quite extensive, very rough rapids. All the other rapids were mild by comparison. And this one, although you could walk around all the other ones, you were not allowed to walk around this one because if they lost a motor hitting a rock or something, they would not be able to come back and pick you up. So everyone was captive on this raft. We were told we had to hunker down and hang on to the ropes that were binding the supplies in the middle of the raft. And so we headed through or not through, aimed at this hole in this very rough water. And at the last minute, they went along the edge of it. They figured out some way that was how to do it. And we successfully got through that very extensive rapids. So this was featured in this video. And my then 6-year-old, after we watched the video, said, "I don't want to take the color out of the river." Next year, however, we did go on that trip, and the kids actually lay face down over the front of the raft and quite enjoyed the earlier rapids. and they had no complaints when we hit that big one. Me, I was terrified, but it was an exquisite experience because we never knew, and here we are, beginner's mind again, what we were going to meet around what corner or wherever. We slept at night on sandbars, and they were full of these tiny, colorless, clear, colorless, what are they? The guys that sting. So there was every opportunity to get stung. And at one point, I was sitting on a very small rock, maybe about this big, and I looked down, and there were 4 of them on the rock. So, and at one point, one morning as we were waking up, we discovered that one of the other travelers on the group had used his shaving cream to repel one of those guys as it was heading towards him in the middle of the night. There are plenty of opportunities when we are able to go into that space of not knowing. If we've had difficult situations in our life, we often try to avoid that and go into our heads instead. And so as we're doing our practice in the early years, all those avoidance techniques are rampant. And we're trying to learn how to simply be so profoundly present that we can enter that mind state of not knowing, of beginner's mind, of openness to possibility. This is why early practice is so challenging, because we are sort of trying to row uphill or up rapids, upriver, and against the current of our habit patterns. We can do it, but this is a source of frustration usually to new Zen students. Know that it is vital. Know that it's only habit patterns that are interfering with your being able to simply experience. And that as you continue to work with especially this extended out-breath, just like our member who was learning to breathe and blow the French horn without any idea of where the end of the breath was going to be, where the end of the song was going to be. None of that. It was incredibly excellent foundation for Zen practice. And the extended out breath, the Susokan, can give us the same thing. Not knowing is important. And just like yesterday, I was quoting Dogen, founder of the Soto sect in Japan, when he said, to study the way, the Buddha way, to study Zazen, for example, to do Zazen, is to study the self, to explore what's going on in our minds without trying to direct it, without analyzing it, just observing it and being curious, open to possibility. To enter the path is to explore explore the mind. To explore the mind is to forget the mind. When we're deeply engrossed in full presence, the presence of not unknowing, and yet it's important to realize that right within that presence of unknowing, there can be a lot of chatter in our heads. But if it's just experienced as background noise, then it's very different, where it doesn't matter if there's a lot of chatter in our heads. We don't have to get into a specific mind state to be able to practice. What we need to do to practice is to simply be so present with whatever is going on. And we do that through tuning into the felt sense in the body, feeling the energies moving around in the body, exploring what being alive really feels like, without any analysis, without any intellectual interpretation, just being there, just exploring, as tiny children do when we're exploring this new world that they've been born into. To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. In other words, you're so present that everything is quite amazing. Only you're not thinking, oh, this is amazing. The experience is one of technicolor, of such amazing presence that you're forgotten, and everything is rich and incredible. And to forget the self, to be enlightened by the 10,000 things, is to remove the barrier between self and other. Because there is really no barrier between ourselves and anything else, anybody else. But we are so accustomed to perceiving it differently that we don't recognize the true reality. I'd like to quote now from Ganto. Ganto was a deeply realized Chan master. He was Chinese. His Chinese name was Yonto, and of course in Japanese it's pronounced Ganto. And he's notable because he didn't live a long life. It was a time of great turmoil in China when he was alive. He had had a deep awakening experience, and I'm sure multiple deep awakening experiences, rather young, and became a teacher. And one day his temple was overrun by bandits seeking whatever they could get of value. All the other monks ran away. He stayed, and he didn't, I'm sure, confront them. He just remained, probably in Zazen, and they skewered him. And so during that moment, as he was being murdered, it is said that he screamed so loudly that it was heard 3 leagues away. Now, a league is 3 miles, so that's 9 miles away. He must have really bellowed. And this was true presence with the experience of being skewered. I don't want to call it murdered, because we have ideas about what murdered is. And he had no ideas about it. He was just fully experiencing the sword piercing him and killing him, with no ideas about what killing meant either. Generations later, in Japan, Hakuin, who had become ordained at the age of 13, I think by our calendar, I think it was 14 by the Eastern calendar, because their way of seeing it is that a person is already a year old when they're born. So sometimes these dates confound us in terms of birth and death. But he got ordained at that young teenage age because he was terrified of falling into hell. He was sure he had brought himself such negative karma when he was younger that the only way to escape hell was to become an ordained monk. And so he did. But when he was 19 years old, he heard the story of Ganto's death, and it just took the wind out of him. He was profoundly discouraged from practice and even left practice for, I think it was only 8 months. And then he finally went back because he realized he was not going to make it as a calligrapher. And maybe he just better proceed with his Zen practice. Many, many years later, decades later, he had further enlightenment experiences. And at one later enlightenment experience, he suddenly realized exactly what Dogen was talking about: removing the barrier between self and other, where there really is no barrier. And he suddenly cried out, "Ganto is alive and well right here now." There's a very, very deep way of understanding that. Hakuin went on to become a very, very, very skilled teacher, so eminent that he is now the essential founder of every single Rinzai sect that has come down to us to this day, because the other ones all died out. His teaching was so strong and so powerful. And if you go to his temple, which is still alive in Japan, you will find that the Zendo there is profoundly strong and deep. And you can do some really, really deep Zazen there. So Ganto has written, or said at least, a number of things. Abandoning things is superior. Pursuing things is inferior. If your own state is empty and tranquil, perfectly illuminated, and silently shining, then you will be able to confront whatever circumstance impinges on you with the indestructible sword of wisdom and cut everything off, everything from the myriad entangling objects, to the verbal teachings of the past and present. Then your awesome, chilling spirit cuts off everything, and everything retreats of itself without having to be pushed away. And this is very important, without having to be pushed away. Isn't this what it means to be well endowed and have plenty to spare? If the basis you establish is not clear, if you're least bit bogged down in hesitation and doubt, then you will be dragged off by entangling conditions, and obviously you will not be able to separate yourself from them. How can you avoid being turned around by other things? When you are following other things, you will never have any freedom. That's a sort of backwards way of expressing beginner's mind. It doesn't mean, and you have to be very careful to understand this, it doesn't mean pushing anything away. When our minds are scrambled with thoughts, bits of conversations, fragments of music, sudden spontaneous words, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It's not about fighting those things. It's about sinking deep beneath them to the deep, quiet waters within our own mind. It's as if you're riding this great boulder, or you are this great boulder that is sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into the darkness of the depths of the sea. Silent, inwardly letting go. Go ahead and let the thoughts do what they want to. They'll die in the vine when you don't give them any energy. And you will be in that openness to possibility without trying to be. Search deeply, open to presence with curiosity. Not knowing. And in this way, you will go deeply into practice. So don't bother fighting the bats that are flying around or chasing the butterflies in your own mind. Sink below. Open to the present moment. Increasingly fully. When you take time to focus on what you're doing, physically, energetically, it takes you closer to that. So the more you can pay attention in your daily life and allow yourself to fully be present, focus on what you're doing in that moment, fully. That will go a long way to taking your practice deeper as well. So when you open the door in the morning and step out into the weather, take a moment just to be present with the experience of that, without thinking, oh darn, it's going to rain today again, or oh darn, it's not going to rain. Leave that behind. Just open and experience the quality of the air, the quality of the world around you, the energy of the world around you, and do it in an ongoing manner. Train yourself to do that over and over again, and you will proceed deeply into your practice so that when you're on the cushion, it will be so much easier to truly focus. Of course, that means limiting your electronic toys. These days, unfortunately, most of us reach for the electronics as a way of escaping the present moment. How many times do you need to check your email today? How many times do you have to check the news today? Can you go another few hours without it? Or can you check your email once during the day, respond to messages, and let it go until the next day without some sense of anxiety, without some sense of needing to keep checking? Be aware of these things, all of these things. And in that way, your practice will deepen immeasurably, even when you're not on the cushion. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.